Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining a Collegial Conversation with Diana Clark. Today, joining Diana is Hilary Jacobs Hendel. Hilary is the author of the international award-winning book, It's Not Always Depression, and is an advocate for mental health, well-being, emotions, and the change triangle. She's a certified psychoanalyst and often supervises for psychotherapists. During today's conversation, Diana and Hilary will be discussing topics on our core emotions and how our bodies react when we experience distress or our core emotions become extremely intense for us. Thank you very much for joining, Hilary. I will now pass the conversation over to Diana.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for joining. You and I had met in a different professional circle, and I was really excited after we met, and bought the book, It's Not Always Depression, and I've been interested in talking to you about its concept since. So thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you too for having me.
So let's start with the title, It's Not Always Depression. If we are looking at the world through a lens of depression, what are we seeing and what might it be instead?
Right. Well, the way that I learned in this type of method of psychotherapy that I became so enamored by, because it didn't only kind of keep us in our head, it involved being aware of our thoughts, but also being aware of our emotions, which live in the body. And what I learned through this quote unquote healing oriented method of therapy is that symptoms like depression, which I used to think were sort of the end of the story, I'm depressed, I need medication, which I was depressed in my late 20s and 30s. I took Prozac, it got me out of bed, terrific. But then when I learned this method, I learned that depression is a symptom, just like anxiety, just like almost all the diagnoses in the DSM, the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists use, are symptoms of underlying emotions that were once at one time overwhelming, that we were left to be overwhelmed by these things called core emotions in the face of too much aloneness, which left us no choice but to learn how to push them down, avoid them, bury them, suppress them, repress them, dissociate from them, whatever you want to call it, and on various degrees. And what we have instead, because our body is so wise, is what we can detect are these symptoms like depression. But many depressions, even though they're genetically every symptom that we have is kind of a mix of genetics and experience, but that you can do a lot to not only ease depression, but heal depression by helping people get in touch with the underlying core emotions and help them come up and out like nature designed for them to do, and symptoms melt away and people feel more calm and confident and clear and connected and compassionate and all those good things that happen when we are regulated.
So let me ask a basic question. What are the core emotions that we're talking about?
Yeah. So the core emotions that I write about, what I did is after learning this method, which is steeped in current neuroscience and theory of trauma and transformation and how emotions work in the mind and body and infant mother research, is this was an academic concept. I didn't invent anything new, that I saw so much. It helped my mental health so much that after practicing for about 10 years, I thought there's no reason that this could not be basic education taught in high school, really. And so what I did is I kind of reconfigured the triangle, which maybe I should just pop up on a screen share.
Yeah, that'd be great if you can do that.
People can also Google it and print out a copy from my website.
Perfect.
But basically, I took the core emotions because theoreticians will talk about slightly differently what the basic core emotions are. And these are pre-wired into the brain, and they are designed to make us move in ways that are adaptive, right? So these are survival emotions that Charles Darwin wrote about at the turn of the century and have been studied clinically and through research ever since. So the core emotions that I put on the change triangle that get people into the most amount of trouble when they bury them, and also because they're hard to deal with, are fear, down here, core emotions: fear, anger, sadness, disgust, joy, excitement, and sexual excitement. And it's important to know that all these core emotions, we come born with them pre-wired, like individual programs that are there to help us. So if those who are listening take one thing away from this talk, it's really that core emotions just are. You're not weak for having them. You're not bad. They're nothing to be ashamed of or guilty for having. And that was a revelation to me, because my dad was a psychiatrist, and we didn't do emotions. We tried to rise above emotions and control them and use them wisely, but there was no direct connection to these core emotions, which are located in the body. And that also was sort of an epiphany for me. It's like, oh, of course they are. I feel them physically, but that idea that there was a connection, which we can talk about later, of what happens when emotions get triggered. We can't stop them. We can only stop them. We can only control them after they're coursing through our physiology, and that they're body based, because they're supposed to make us move. Like, for example, if a wild bear was to bust into your room right there, Diana, you would be running. Even you wouldn't have had the thought, oh, there's a bear, I'm scared, I should run. Your eyes would see it, your ears would hear it, it would activate your body based on the fear program, which would get your arms and legs ready for running. It would shunt blood away from your digestive system towards your heart so that you could survive the bear's entrance into your room. And that's basically, you couldn't control that from happening. But after you were safe enough, you'd be able to say, oh, I was afraid, and be able to think about what to do next.
So let me talk about that for just a second. Keep those up there. Let's imagine that a young person is afraid of abandonment. Mm-hmm. How does that play out in this kind of thing with a core emotion? And then how would that turn into depression?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start then at the beginning. So we are born, right, with these. If you study babies, and if you have young children, any of you in your family, you'll see that you're born and babies are not inhibited yet by life, right? These inhibitions that happen at the top of the triangle. They let you know when they're angry. They let you know when they're sad. They let you know when they're frightened. They let you know when they're happy. So let's say that I'm a little baby and I show some anger to my mother or father. And because none of us get any emotions education, and most parents don't know just like all of us, what to do with emotions as opposed anything other than just shutting them down. So let's say my anger makes my mother upset and anxious, and she glazes over, or she leaves me alone. She walks out in a huff, or maybe she gets more angry. And that's perceived as a break in the connection, the positive connection between us, which is so important. My brain will learn that anger elicits a reaction in my mother that is unsafe for me, which is a disconnection, the abandonment. It could be a physical abandonment, or it could be that emotional abandonment. The connection is lost between us. And so what I learn every time I feel anger now is my brain has learned this is not safe. I'm going to push that anger down. And the way that I can do that is with all sorts of maneuvers that we're so clever and able to do that we will feel as anxiety, right? We can use holding our breath and muscular contraction to keep down the energy of anger. And we can use shame. It's like retreating into a turtle shell. It's an entire visceral withdrawal from our core self and our feelings, or guilt. We can use any of those three mechanisms to push the energy of that anger and the awareness of that anger down. And then we develop these brilliant creative defenses that keep us from feeling so awful perpetually, like working too much, like eating too little, like going for a drink when we're older, those type of things. So in this case of this child that learns at a young age that they will be abandoned if they show their true feelings, they start to bury them perpetually. And it generalizes not only to their parents, but to other people, because there's, again, the way we're wired is it sets up an expectation of how people will be with us in the world. So then let's say you have relationships and you're afraid to show anger, so you can't say no or set limits and boundaries, and you're constantly pushing down that resentment, and you're just shoving it down, and all you're feeling is smaller and smaller and anxious. Depression from the stress, the chronic stress on the mind and the body, can be one symptom that will result. And in fact, that was my experience when I was younger, before I learned all of this, that I had too much stress. I was a workaholic. I just thought I could do everything, and I could just keep pushing away my emotions, and that I could do that because for some reason I thought I was special, that I could do that. And I ended up with a clinical depression, and which I wasn't even aware of until my sister had lunch with me one day and said, "I think you're depressed." And then I was like, "Oh yeah, you're right." I went to a psychiatrist, took the medicine, and it helped. But when I learned the change triangle, from then on, I was able to, if I experienced a symptom like anxiety or depression, I knew really to redo that, to undo that kind of damage that had been done early on, and find my emotions and make space for them. Even just validating I am angry or I am sad, the science shows that somehow it integrates the mind and the body and the left brain and right brain, so that's calming. But emotions just want to be validated at the least, and at the most, they want room for that energy to come up and out. And these core emotions are wave-like in action, that when we focus in on the physical sensation, they will move through us. But that can take a lot of work and a lot of courage to do. So change triangle is a lifelong process of working, just like mindfulness, but it's sort of mindfulness with a map of what to look for and how to be with what we find in safe and gentle ways.
So my own therapist, back when I was a young woman, said to me, because this clearly explains my own repressed emotion, she said, she didn't use this change triangle because it was a millennial ago, but she said, every feeling fully felt passes. It's the ones you stuff that go sideways.
She was a good therapist.
He was a good therapist. And that speaks to that stuffing. When I look at that arrow, the feelings we stuff come sideways, right?
Exactly. And so I have different versions of the triangle. The first one would show actually a line. I could almost maybe draw it, but it would be a line that would cut us off on the bottom of the triangle. So most people are in defense and inhibitory emotions for most of their life. And what we're trying to do by connecting with ourselves, again, by learning specific tools and techniques. I could have never done this without my AEDP training. It's the type of therapy that taught me all about this and the science of emotions, which I didn't even think there was. And I had the best science education money could buy. So it was a conspicuous absence. When I first saw this at a conference back in 2004, the triangle immediately, it made sense to me. I think I'd had enough psychological education to use this right away. But I also thought, where was this information? And then 10 years later, I was like, I want to write about this for the public. happy to teach therapists, but I really think this should be taught in high school. And it will give people tools to be kinder to themselves, if anything, at the least, and to really process emotions and minimize trauma, not only individual trauma, but if parents learn the change triangle, and if everybody learned about emotions, I think our collective trauma would decrease, because we would not unwittingly be creating so much anxiety and shame and guilt and depression in all of us by our dysfunctional society.
That's so true. Do you find that there are certain emotions in those core emotions that people are more apt to stuff?
I think that people really can stuff any emotion, but anger is a tough one for most people, because they equate. So kind of the base thing to know about a core emotion is that it's a physical experience. In fact, the word emotion comes from the Latin and French word to move. Mm-hmm. And so they ready our body for this adaptive action. And anger, the ones that have a lot of energy towards them, pull for these impulses, right? So the emotion gets triggered. Let's say my husband says something hurtful to me, then I get that jolt of like, both hurt and anger. And I feel it in my body. And most people feel that the experience of anger is one and the same as letting it loose. And one of the first things I teach is that experiencing emotions, one, doesn't mean wearing your heart on your sleeve, and it doesn't mean permission to act out our emotions in ways that aren't thoughtful and in ways that we want our next move to be constructive and not destructive, either for ourselves or someone else. So that I break down that we want to experience our anger, which is a completely internal experience, calming ourselves enough through various, again, tools, tips, and techniques, that we can begin to bring our thinking brain back online. Because we all know when we're like hot red with anger, it's very hard to think clearly. In fact, often we do things that we later regret and apologize for. But if we can come to recognize that jolt of anger, and instead of letting it speed us up and say and do things that are hurtful, change our automatic response to be an immediate pulling back on the reins, right? To ground and breathe, as I teach, to say, okay, I am furious right now. I know I'm furious because I feel this energy coming up. And if it's so huge, I can use fantasy, I can use a whole bunch of sort of techniques to get out that energy, so that I can think through the last step. What do I want to do with this anger? Sometimes it's coming from the past, and I recognize that my husband is not my mother, and I'm not going to lay into him now. I really have to work with this part of myself, either if I have the skills to do that alone or with a therapist. Or I may say, yes, he did something hurtful, and I'm going to take that anger and put it in my backbone and say, hey, you know what? That was really hurtful. I don't want you to call me dumb again. I don't want you to talk to me that way. Mm-hmm. And to set a limit and boundary, to know when to leave a relationship, right? To use anger and to use our emotions in conjunction with our thoughtful, rational, logical mind. The two together will give us the most capacity to meet the challenges of life. And sadly, our society, for a variety of interesting reasons, I think, I'd like to write was thinking of writing on the history of emotions, but I basically has lost, there was that whole idea that there was no mind-body connection, and that's kind of come back, but it's really through the vagus nerve. It's not abstract, that the vagus nerve is the big conduit that connects the brain and the ignition of the emotions and then into the body to prepare it for action. And then after our body is already charged up with an emotion, our cortex and the subcortical areas of the brain, you can see here, can start to perceive what's happening in the body. So initially, the core emotion happens in the middle of the brain. There's no conscious control. I'm just showing this because a picture's worth 1,000 words. And then the emotion starts here and it activates the lower brain, which comes down here through the nerve to activate the body. And then we have control over the impulses. We don't have control to prevent the emotion, although we can change our emotional reactions over time by working the change triangle.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Do you notice that there is a difference in your patient or client population between men and women? Which core emotions are more apt to be stuffed or?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Because the way we feel about emotions is shaped from our earliest relationships, and then as you come out in the world, our siblings and our peers and our schools and our communities and our religions. So we are socialized in a way. And so you may guess that women are socialized to be sweet. And if we're angry, we're considered BB, the bitch word. And men are like, it's okay to be angry. And sexual excitement is a lot more permissive for men. And sadness and fear is a lot more permissive for women. Poor men get a terrible rap in our culture because they are socialized to think that sadness and fear are weak. Mm-hmm. And very, therefore, those, because they feel ashamed if they have those emotions, they push them down because it brought humiliation from parents and then peers. Little boys who cry, don't be a sissy. Mm-hmm. Boys don't cry. And we see the rates of depression and suicide in men. And I really think it has to do with the lack of emotions education, that it's completely natural. All genders, sexes, every gender in between the binaries, everybody has the same core emotions. And the change triangle is universal, works the same way for all people, which is comforting. And also, I love the logic of the triangle in and of itself. Even though emotions feel illogical, there's a real logic to how they work.
They bring up, we defend, we engage in some inhibitory emotion. And then if we work through it, we can get back to through core, right? Into calm.
Exactly. So like with addictions, right? Addictions are a defense, and it's a defense that works great in the moment, right? Mm-hmm. You want to numb those feelings, you can take a drug and do it. So there's a lot of positive reinforcement. Exactly. The problem is long-term, it destroys your life. So a lot of these defenses, all defenses, when they were created, mostly in childhood, they're amazing. We needed them, right? They're not.
Yeah.
We absolutely needed them. The problem is when we get older and we can have our brains are more mature, we have a better capacity to handle emotions, we're still operating like we can't. And the memories that we can't are pervasive unconsciously or out of awareness until we start to dip our toe in the water of working this triangle, which, for example, a great way to start is just to, in a moment of anxiety, just to gently scan your body and ask yourself, how do I know I'm anxious? What's happening in my body? For me, it's like a fluttering in my chest, kind of a vibrating feeling. And I remember the first time I was asked to do this in a training, when I was probably the very first training of ADP, and somebody said, can you turn into the feeling of anxiety in your body? And I was like, what? No way, I'll lose control. It'll get bigger. But I trusted, and I went for a leap of faith, and I turned inward, and I just noticed the anxiety with some curiosity and loads of compassion for myself as I was directed. And my anxiety went down, because it turns out when you focus on a physical sensation that's emotional in nature, it's a counterintuitive experience. It allows flow, and specifically with anxiety, it calms the anxiety. And so that's a great way to begin, but there is a leap of faith. And that's why I wrote all the stories in the book, so people could be a fly on the wall first of me. Because learning the change triangle, it's a two-dimensional, it's an intellectual concept. And sadly, we can't think our way through emotions. They have to be experienced in the body. And so writing stories is the closest way, as opposed to me being in the room with everybody that I could possibly be in, to demonstrate what it's like, what happens with each moment to moment move. I turn in, I find my anxiety, I breathe, my anxiety lowers, and then I can look for the underlying emotions that are located here.
Am I angry? Am I scared? Am I excited?
Yeah. Exactly. And it's extremely, I find just extremely helpful. And everybody that learns the change triangle, most people, I've never heard it. There's no downside to understanding how this works. And then people on various levels, based on what they want and where they are in their personal development and growth, can work it a little bit more, maybe a little bit more. Then you discover your blocks and you're like, well, maybe I'm going to find a therapist that can help me get beyond some of my fears about being with certain emotions. And it's a game changer.
I love it. So let me ask one last question. For that mom, dad sitting out there wondering, did I do something that created this repression of core emotions?
What would I say?
Didn't we all
did.
Okay.
Me included. I made so many mistakes because I didn't have the information. And I think that's why I have just been so passionate. I have my private practice and I love working with people one-on-one, but really teaching people about emotions is like it's
mission.
Yeah, it really is. Because had I known, and I teach very specifically, had I known how to be with sadness, for example, I had a wonderful mother, but we didn't do sadness. And I mean wonderful, meaning that she was connected. She was psychologically minded. She used to go to lectures at the New York Psychoanalytic with my dad, who was a psychiatrist, I mentioned, and read books on parenting. And she was endlessly supportive and loving. So a great mom, but we didn't do sadness. So meaning there was no acknowledgement. It was just like how to feel better. And hence I grew up being, when any type of loss, so sadness is a core emotion that comes up in response to loss. Could be the loss of a person, it could be the loss of a cherished object, a home, a homeland, a city. And we're all wired for sadness. So what would happen if you can't feel sadness when somebody died? My dog, my grandmother, friends of my parents, and then as I got older, peers. Before I learned this, I would get incredibly anxious and avoidant. I couldn't be around. In fact, I was going to be a medical doctor, like my dad. I got into medical school and I started to realize, oh my God, I can't deal with death and dying. I'd be anxious all the time. And so that's how I segued into becoming
sadness.
Yeah. And then years later, a therapist, which was what I was meant to do, I think. So I couldn't feel sadness. I didn't even know it was there. I felt anxiety until I saw the change triangle. And then I started writing about how parents and partners can be with sadness after I learned it myself, by not trying to fix it necessarily or asking permission, but just being with that. You can't take away the sadness of another person. They have to go through it, and that's in their own time. But to be able to be connected, to give a therapeutic hug. I also write about hugs a lot. I'm into the physiological calming of hugs.
Oxytocin.
Yes, exactly. Just to listen to somebody who wants to talk, just to hold their hand. That's all we can do. And if someone had taught me just that I didn't have to fix, or I just had to be, I wouldn't have been as anxious. I felt pressure and I didn't know what to do. So simple human things that we should be learning about, I think, by about junior year in high school, and that parents don't know because we didn't get any emotions education. It's not our fault, and I don't believe in blame, but I do believe that now that we know this information exists, there's a responsibility to learn about emotions so that we don't unwittingly create anxiety and shame and guilt in our children and our loved ones by shutting them down, that we can make space for emotions and corral behaviors that are appropriate. I think a lot of parents fear if I let my kid be angry, then I'm giving them permission to act badly. And we have to separate those things. You can be angry, but you can't hit
and you can't do this.
Exactly. And here's some alternatives to help you. And mom and dad, it's okay to have a reaction to your kid, but take a moment and work the change triangle. And I really advocate people print out a copy of the change triangle.
Put it on the fridge.
On the fridge, and everybody can refer to it like we do in our groups and things that we're teaching about education. So we can say, oh, what's underneath this behavior, this feeling that
I love that. Yeah.
And
just a feeling. They all pass.
Yeah.
They're feelings. Well, thank you again for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And I love the change triangle. I would encourage all of you watching to buy it. It's not always depression. There's some great stories in there and some tools and just lines in there worthy of underlining. So,
yes, may I just say that it's a self-help book that's written so someone 15 years and older. There's no jargon in it. There's no kind of psychobabble BS. I really wanted it to be a basic education.
Accessible. It is accessible.
Yeah.
Totally. Well done on that. Yeah.
Thanks. Exercises and whatnot. And then my website has a ton of free resources. And if anyone listening wants to stay connected, you can join my email list, and I send out a new article once a month, and I have classes and all sorts of cool things for people that want to work the change triangle.
Learn more, practice. Yes. Well, thank you again for joining me. I've enjoyed this thoroughly.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.